And now I would be delighted to bring back Gena Gorlin, PhD. Gena, would you join me on the stage? There she is. Hi, Gena. Let's make sure. Let's open your mic. There we
Beautiful.
go.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I was excited that you agreed to join us today. Partly 'cause I've been really interested in your work for many years now, and the theme that I want to draw out today is the focus that you have. So you have a number of roles, I suppose that's one way to put it. So you are a scholar, you teach at UT Austin in a clinical capacity, and you do research, or you have been doing research. You're also a licensed psychologist helping people in a clinical setting, and you now have this additional role as a founder coach, which is part of what I really want to focus on in today's conversation. I want to give people a sense of where they can learn more about you and what I've been reading in terms of as context for this conversation. They can explore it subsequently. So you have a Substack that I think is really flourishing. From what I understand, it's getting a lot of attention and it's really thriving. It's called Building the Builders. And people can go, and we'll remind them about that at the end. What I'd like to do is we often have people who are new to the Institute. So I want to give them just a quick snapshot of your history with the Institute and just fill in the blanks if I'm missing something significant. So I won't put dates on this because it's never politic to talk about people's ages. But I remember crossing paths with you many years ago when you were in high school, and you were a winner of our essay contest, not once, but twice. And I think maybe three times. I don't know. And we might have had to change the rules or exclude you at some point because you were really successful with the essay contest on the Fountainhead. So I've always been impressed with that. And I think you've been connected to the Institute in an educational capacity through our training programs, the OAC, the Objectives Academic Center, now subsumed under Ayn Rand University. You've spoken at our conference, OCON, the Objectivist Summer Conference. You've been a scholar at the conference, attending. So you've had a long relationship with the Institute. And
no particular order.
Yeah. Say that again?
In no particular order.
Yeah. So, and I have to say, speaking for myself, I really value that relationship that we have with you, and I'm excited to talk more about this new area. I think of it as new. I'm curious how it sort of arose in your work. And so your background is you have a PhD in psychology from University of Virginia, and you've been practicing and teaching. You used to teach at Yeshiva University. Now you're at Texas. So that's a snapshot for people who are maybe not as familiar with Gena's work or her background. Okay, so let's dive into this area that you have writing on this subject, and I understand you coach founders and people building companies. Let's start with, how did this arise for you? So you had an academic position, you were doing research in clinical. How did you get interested in helping people build companies and build themselves?
Yeah, it's sort of a circuitous path as they tend to be, but also one that makes a lot of sense in retrospect. So as a professor on the tenure track at Yeshiva University, as you mentioned, I was carving out my research program, but also really starting to think about whom do I want to be serving, and who is my distinct customer, if you will, right? And of course, already thinking somewhat more entrepreneurially than my average academic colleague, partly because I, was married into the startup world, right, via Matt, Bateman, who's my husband, but also had been friends for many years with people like Ray, Gern, Keith Schacht, following the story of Blake, Scholl, who's building Supersonic, and have just been so inspired by what some of my friends have built, and have drawn kind of distinct inspiration from their whole kind of approach to life, which is different from the typical academic approach. And it was different from a lot of my defaults, in the sense that there's a bias toward action, right? There's a real sense of both kind of joy in creation, like of high agency. Like, I don't work on the things I don't want to work on because time is too precious and too limited. And why should I have to? Nothing, there are no have tos in life, other than death than taxes, if we right, kind of follow that proverb. So this kind of sense of everything is chosen, and that you've got to make it happen, right? Like, which of course is also a lot of what drew me to objectivism, in the first place, right? And it's not an accident that entrepreneurs are some of the, fictional paragons of Rand's worldview, right, and philosophy, because I think it's where the rubber hits the road in terms of really building, creating the value that you want to surround yourself with in your life, right? And bringing value into the world, shaping the world according to your vision, according to your, rational convictions, and pursuing your joy for real, right? Not just for pretend, and not just kind of at a pie in the sky level. And so I've always loved and been drawn to the entrepreneurial spirit. And then at some point it dawned on me in that very same, spirit, in applying that spirit, that, what, I can just choose who I work with. Like, I don't have to wait for, the people who happen to find me through my existing connections or through my Psychology Today listing, or, through the diagnoses that I happen to have specialized in up to this point. Like, I can proactively go and seek out the people I'm most interested in working with. And as I thought more and more about who are those people, like who would I be most excited to serve, and for whom would I have the most unique value proposition, right? Like, there's a mantra that I think Jim Collins, who is a business guy who wrote these books about what makes great companies and lasting and enduring great companies, and he talks about kind of finding the thing that you can be best in the world at, right? And he's kind of giving that as advice at the corporate level, or at the kind of organizational level. But just as, I mean, the examples he uses apply just as much to the individual level. Like, to make the most of your life, find the thing that you are uniquely, suited to do in a way that's going to come more naturally to you than to other people, in a way that you already have a lot of accumulated expertise, right? Like, and that you love. And so I was thinking about what that is, and increasingly starting to realize, like, wait, nobody in psychology cares about entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. I do. And turns out that their lives are really hard. Turns out that they are facing all sorts of challenges that I know how to help them with because of everything I've learned as a clinical psychologist. But my fellow clinical psychologists, like, aren't thinking about their needs, because what, entrepreneurs, they're not a high risk at, underserved, et cetera, high need population. And I'm thinking, yeah, they are underserved for a lot of these reasons. And so and then I kind of networked and got one opportunity after another to break into that world that, happened the way these things happen, through serendipitous Twitter connections, and then, word of mouth. And now now it's what I do, I guess, fast forwarding 4 or 5 years.
I want to dive into some of the things you've written and explore the ideas that you're presenting. So we can talk a bit about the experiences you've had one-on-one with founders. I'd love to hear more about that. I just want to talk about the things you've published already, because in terms of setting up the frame that you use. And one of the things, right before we connected today, I was reading, I can't remember how many of your articles are. I went down a rabbit hole of Gena articles. It was really fascinating. I encourage people to do it. And you're a very strong writer, just as someone who works in writing. I really appreciate that. One of the things that leapt out of some of these articles is, if I didn't know you had an association with Ayn Rand and an interest in her ideas, but I knew Ayn Rand, I would detect influence. And I know that there is influence because it's sort of a conscious perspective on your part. So I want to draw out some of that theme a bit. But let's start, as a way into that, I want to talk a bit about one of the perspectives you offer in your Substack, which let me set up the issue and then sort of indicate what you say about this, and I think this will be fruitful. So a lot of people think about the challenges of work-life balance, and it's a real issue. And one thing I've come to think about in talking to some of my colleagues and thinking about this as well, is that the balance might not be the right conceptualization, and maybe it's integration. And there's a real question of how to relate those two. And I imagine people working to build companies, that is just, okay, I have a lot of things to do. How do they fit together? And so I want to talk about the piece that you've written about, you set up these two alternatives of a drill sergeant and a Zen master. And then these are two poles, and then people think, well, I can't, this one isn't working for me, this one isn't working for me, I'm going to go the middle ground. So maybe it would be helpful if you could talk to us a bit about, what are these two conceptions that you see people trying to solve this problem, and how do you approach this issue from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Alon. This is a great setup for me for what I've been thinking a lot about. I also gave an Ocon talk on roughly this topic last summer, in case anyone wants to but review it. But I've also updated my thinking in a lot of ways. So it's out of date. Anyway, so yeah, so the distinction, this drill sergeant versus Zen master distinction, it sort of came out of a lot of observations I was making while working with ambitious people, with founders, just generally, anybody who's sort of an overachiever, quote unquote, who sets high standards for themselves, is conscientious, where we get cultural messages. So, and right now, actually, the way we see it is you hear a lot about hustle culture in Silicon Valley, but also kind of productivity circles more generally here. And often you hear this term used derogatorily by the self-care culture, by those on the kind of the life side of the work-life balance dichotomy, if you will, right? Where on the one hand, you've got this, the hustle culture that packages within it a kind of almost mindless, slavish obsession with maximizing the amount of time that you work and just driving yourself really hard. Cold plunges are a kind of current buzzword, associated with that movement, right? Like just plunge yourself into, ice water and then go start your day. And like where you detect, and of course, like there are elements to it that are really good in terms of like valuing productiveness and aiming high and, being ambitious, being an achiever, right? But what it packages in with it is often this kind of conventionality around what it is you're trying to work toward, and why, and for the sake of whom or what. And it turns into a kind of, a kind of slavish grind. It turns into a source of guilt and shame and secondhanded, pressure to conform, in effect, right? The pressure to beat out the other guy. That like there's a very Keating-esque flavor to it, if you will, right? Since I know this audience will will recognize the reference. And on the flip side, the kind of reaction against that whole mentality is what I've been calling the Zen master mindset, which is shorthand for, don't work yourself to death. The moment is all there is. You're just going to make yourself miserable. Life can't be all about working. Savor the moment. You can't control, these outcomes are out of your control. So don't get too attached, right, to any particular goal or any particular win or loss. It's about the journey, not the destination. Kind of focus more on your own personal development, on your shadow work, on creating psychological safety. This is another buzzword in that kind of subculture, if you will, right? And again, like there are elements of truth and there are really valuable tactics, right, that come under this umbrella, but they're packaged in again with a detached understanding of what the self is and how the self gets built and maintained, right, and nurtured, where there's this internal focus on nurturing our subjective experience apart from whatever it is we're actually doing and building in the world, right? Apart from how our life is actually going out here, like how is our work, how are our relationships, what are we able to go and do it by choice that brings us joy, like what does our savings account look like, how are we thinking about our future, and are we set up to be resilient in the face of illness or economic downturns. And so that's the dichotomy that I'm trying to kind of notice and address. Like, this is a false dichotomy. There's a third way, basically. And
the reaction to both of those is, well, there has to be some middle ground. And tell me about how you think of it. My guess is you're not on you don't think it's a balance. Yeah, go ahead. How do you, so the other thing I want to say just before you answer that, let me add one more layer here. One thing that I really found interesting is that you not only don't take this middle ground, which I want to hear more about what that looks like, is your view is that ultimately both of these have a common core, common premise behind them. So like beyond the surface, they're similar. So maybe you could tell us a bit about both of those. What's your answer to that in your current thinking? What is in common between those two?
Yeah. So both perspectives assume that kind of take certain things for granted as just like metaphysically given, to put it in objective terms, or just part of the furniture of the universe, to put it in like more Steve Jobsian terms, right? They assume that certain standards are just the received and intrinsically right standards of worth by which we judge ourselves, to the extent that we want to judge ourselves at all, right? Like if you want to be successful, here's the set of templates for how to be successful as a human being. You be a successful founder, or a successful doctor, or a successful politician, or a successful, social justice activist, whatever it is, but like, here's what that looks like. And either and that's the yardstick to measure yourself on. And either you should be really, really ambitious about trying to get really high up on that yardstick, or you should go easy on yourself and not try so hard to get quite so high up on that yardstick, because it's impossible to, to get beyond a certain point, and you're going to end up slipping anyway. And, it's just a source of misery to hold too tightly to these, standards. But neither of them asks the question, are these the right yardsticks? Are they the only yardsticks? Like, right? Like, are these the only or the best ways to live? And so both begin from a premise of, we are helpless in the face of these intrinsic goods, right? Like we are kind of that, our human agency doesn't extend to the choice of goals, the choice of what to value, or the choice of the kind of life we pursue. That our agency is rather low on both of these perspectives, right? Either we have agency over how hard we push ourselves, but not over the why or the what, right? Or we just don't even, whereas the Zen master acknowledges like, no, it's, you don't have as much agency as you think over that. So just don't try so hard, right? Or don't beat yourself up so much when you fail. But right, neither of them assumes a place of like, you decide. It's your life. You own your life. So you decide what yardstick to use, and you design the yardstick that is derived from your understanding of your personal needs, and the needs and your needs as a human being, and what's gonna set you up to reap the greatest meaning and joy from your life.
I just want to share something with everyone in the audience. I'm not sure everyone has read this article by Ayn Rand, but when I was reading your work last night and previously, I kept thinking of this article. Here it is. It's Causality versus Duty. And I can see you responding to this. And I think this has had a lot of really powerful impact on many people. And one of the points of contact that just to what you've just been raising here is this idea of people acting on standards that are external to them, independent of their own interests and their own conception of what the good is, their understanding of it. And Ayn Rand, the way she begins this essay, for people who haven't read it, I'll just read it to you. One of the most destructive anti-concepts in the history of moral philosophy is the term, quote, duty. And then, so this is putting it in a moral context, but I think that part of what I wanted people to see is this really strong connection here between how you conceive of the standards you're measuring yourself by. Maybe it's just in a work setting, but I think there's moral dimensions to that. And then sort of fundamentally just being first-handed about one's understanding of what is the goal, how am I judging myself, versus, well, that's what people do. So I'm going to either drive myself like a drill sergeant, as you put it, or I'm going to kick back and just try to dissociate myself into whatever nirvana kind of experience. So am I right that this is an influence on you?
Obviously. So yeah, I mean, and especially I'm glad you singled out that essay, because that essay in particular is the philosophical basis for the drill sergeant. It just is. Like, it's not an indirect, it's a direct through line for me for understanding this mentality. And I cite it and link to it in various places as appropriate, when I'm kind of describing this underlying mindset. But yeah, part of the project I'm engaged in is sort of translating and applying that core insight and framework to the things that people are on about today, right? And to the ways that these dichotomies play out in people's lives in the here and now and in our culture, so that so that it really resonates, which has been, which has been really fun.
And I think this is something, this next topic is one that I think I've heard you speak on in I forget if it's a lecture or if it's just in another setting, but I know this is a rich topic, and it might be from reading some of your articles that, and this, I think this connects to this perspective of what are you trying to measure yourself by, and why that particular, and this idea that there should be a motivation by positive, a motivation by the things you care for, as opposed to minimizing stress, minimizing failure. And I want to tie this to your work with founders, because I wonder if my impression of people building companies is it's this vision that's all consuming, and they think they're investing everything in it because they want to see it realized. And there's a lot of fear that could arise from that, a lot of risk. And I just want to understand how you help people to understand this issue of motivated by, I want to see this positive versus I want to avoid through these destructive feelings. So tell us a bit about how that plays out in your work.
Yeah, I mean, so an important thing to understand about the motivation by love versus fear and distinction is that it's describing a pretty fundamental, pretty kind of high level, pretty abstract dimension of our motivation, on which we can have lots of fear and we can be trying to avoid a lot of things on a love-based motivation, and vice versa. Like we can look like we're pursuing a lot of things and going after things, oh, that person is just after money, or that person is just after fame, but like all of it's actually fundamentally fear driven. And that's one thing that I work with founders and, with others to clarify is like, if we really tease apart, if we sort of parse out your motivations and understand them at kind of these different levels of analysis, levels of fundamentality, like, well, what is it you're afraid of? And why are you afraid of it? What do you care about such that you're afraid of it, right? So a lot of founders will say, like, I never want to be poor again. Especially, we know that immigrants are overrepresented among founders, which in and of itself is an example of what I love about founders, say a lot of the same things I love about us immigrants, right? But particularly those who are like first generation, who really like came up from poverty, who never finished or even went to college, and this is the route that they're taking instead to secure a financial future for themselves and their families, as well as to build something that they are actually interested in, right? And that kind of fits their weird kind of rogue combination of interests and skills. And they'll often talk about it as like, yeah, no, I don't want to be poor. And that can sound two very different ways, broadly too, right? It can sound on further inquiry, it can sound like, yeah, no, I mean, I don't feel that excited about the product. I'm kind of resentful of our customers. This whole thing is a slog for me. But the reason, and I hate VC, like investors are just the worst. And, like everything about this job actually kind of sucks, but I have to do it because I can't be poor. Right? And this is the only way to not be poor. Right? Where then I have a lot of questions like, really, this is the only way to not be poor? I mean, there are so many easier, faster, more assured ways to make a good amount of money, and have job security. Like, this ain't it. Like, if you're looking for job security, being a startup founder ain't it, right? And so that's where I really start to question, like, is this the path? Like, what do you actually want about this path, as opposed to any number of other paths you could be taking that you might actually enjoy, that would also, take care of you financially to the degree that you're afraid, that you'll fail to do, because you remember real privation of the sort that you're probably never going to encounter again in your new context, right? So like that to me might look more like motivation by fear, versus for a lot of founders, to listen to them talk at that kind of first layer of of depth. Yeah, like they'll talk a lot about the things that they're afraid of or the things that they're avoiding. Like, you know what, I don't want to have to, like hearing Blake talk about Supersonic and what inspired him to build Supersonic, or about Boom rather, his company, which is where he's building commercial supersonic airplanes. Like a big part of his motivation is, I hate traveling. And I hate the amount of time and just, all of the rigmarole of waiting at, this, I mean, we all know if we've flown anywhere at all, right? Just like what a hassle it is and how long it takes. And there are places we just don't go because we don't want to have to live through the ordeal of, 8 hours of travel with layovers and standing on the tarmac for, some arbitrary amount of time, right? He hates all that. And that's a big part of, like, he wants to reduce the amount of time that people spend, and, himself included, in the air and waiting, right, to board, etc., so that people can get to where they're going and have the experiences they want to have, right? And like, to me, that's an example of a fully love-based motivation, right? Like, he loves where he's, he loves the experiences on the ground, right? He loves efficiency. He loves, he loves to have impact. He loves technology. He loves problem solving. He loves the grandeur of the conquered and the excitement of trying to take this big next step that humanity has been stalling on. All of that is part of the context for his frustration with travel, right? So you really, like, you have to go down a layer, I think, to figure out, like, what's really motivating this, right? And you can tell talking to him, like, he loves the work, right? And there are definitely parts of it that are a slog and parts of it that are annoying, but like, he's always on a premise of, okay, how do I either make this fun or outsource it or get better enough at it that it's no longer, miserable, or at least like understand where the misery is coming from and reframe however, however I'm understanding it, so that I can see it as part of this bigger picture of, wow, like, I'm actually getting this done, right? Or I'm getting us to the next kind of level of resilience to regulation or to whatever. So
I'm interested in hearing a bit about the difference between coaching founders and the work you do clinically, the more traditional type of, people with situations that we might be more familiar with. So how do you think of the difference? And maybe you could tell us a bit about what are some of the successes insofar as you can anonymize them, or that's a question we've gotten from the chat too.
Yeah. So, okay, wait. So that's 2 questions. Oh, can I see?
Yeah. So let me, I don't think you can see it yet, but so let's start with the first question. So tell us a bit about how you differentiate between what does it look like to coach founders? What are the kind of issues versus the clinical work that you do with other kinds of situations? Then we'll talk about another aspect of that.
Yeah. So I would say coaching founders is like a specific kind of instance, a specific application of the broader toolkit and the broader framework that I use in all of my work, whether it's branded as coaching or therapy. But it's a very specific application. So if you think about, like, so there are plenty of universals, right? As far as the need to understand our own kind of, underlying sort of core premises, beliefs, worldview, right? And how they're influencing us, and the need to manage and learn to manage our own emotions in the course of doing anything more challenging. The need to have agency, right? And to increase our agency from wherever, to kind of remove the various internal or external obstacles to our agency, whether from whatever point we're starting. And a big difference between working with founders and just people in the general population is they're usually starting at a very high point of agency, which is part of what's so fun for me, is that, like, I'm really trying to raise the ceiling rather than trying to raise the floor. And I've written about that a little bit on the Substack, that they'll start from a place of, I already know all these cognitive behavioral tools. Like, I've already got, look, I'm using, like, here's the productivity tool, and here's how I'm pacing myself. And like, I already meditate and I already have hard conversations. I know how to do all that. But like, but like, where I'm stuck is I'm not working on AI, and AI is about to change everything. And I don't know if I should just, like, just cut my losses and try to sell the company, or try to hand it over and build something new in AI. But that would mean, like, not only disappointing all these people who've been counting on me and are expecting me to, kind of take us to IPO, kind of take us the whole distance, but also, like, that's probably going to mean diluting my equity, like if I bring on another CEO, or it'll mean a smaller exit. And like, what are the trade-offs there? And is that actually what I want? Or am I just trying to go after the shiny object? And is it going to actually, become just as much of a slog after a while? And should I just see this through? Like, where I don't know the answer starting out, right? Like, it's a tough enough challenge, kind of existential problem, right? And the stakes are high, but also complex and new, right? Like genuinely nuanced in a way that like I got to get in there and sort of level up with them in terms of like, yeah, wow, how do I think this through? And like, what are the latest frameworks that I've been kind of integrating into my own thinking and understanding that I can apply here to try to provide some value, right? To try to provide a distinct perspective. And often that's also a question of like, well, how does having an explicit philosophy help me here? Like in terms of seeing through some of the internalized duty premises that are still rattling around in there, though very subtly, or that are just kind of skewing the cost benefit calculus for the, like, where they're kind of attributing too much cost to, well, people will be disappointed in me versus, like people are going to get to see me go and actually do something even more ambitious and be inspired by that. And people will be okay. They can take care of themselves, and also I'm not living for them, I'm living for me. Right. So yeah. So that's where like the application is very challenging and interesting, but the fundamentals are all the same.
Is it possible for you to anonymize an example and give us sort of a case? It's like very
And that was
sketchy,
kind of an anonymous example.
like a case study of something that went well, that you like a particular issue that you helped someone. Maybe you've given some examples in passing. Maybe you could give us one that you just develop a bit more.
Sure. So let me give you maybe one or two in outline so that it's not gonna, so no particular founder, if they were listening to this, would know, oh wow, yeah, that's definitely right. But it's a pretty specific pattern that I've seen over a couple of cases. The pattern, so the first pattern is someone has a co-founder. So there are two co-founders or sometimes three, and they've been building a company together for a while, and one of them isn't pulling their weight or has been sort of riding the coattails of the other for some time, and they've never really had it out fully. Like the co-founder who's really pulling most of the weight and who's kind of having to manage the less engaged, less capable co-founder is always kind of trying to deliver like a softened version of that message, or is always kind of walking on eggshells to not upset the weaker co-founder, is really scared of what would happen if they had it out, and like, is the whole company going to fall apart? Are they going to sue me? Is it going to be, a total, are all of our employees going to walk out, like, because they think everything's sort of fine, or they're frustrated at him too, but they think, that I've been on board with all of this. And so is this going to like betray their trust, if they realize that I've actually also been frustrated, but I haven't done anything about it, right? And the outcomes range somewhat, but all the outcomes, those positive outcomes you're asking about, they involve somewhere along the continuum from having some really hard conversations and making some big changes such that the co-founder significantly shifts their role and changes their behavior and becomes not a drain on the company, but actually a positive contributor. And the whole company then is able to move in a better direction and a, kind of more unconflictedly positive direction. Two, the weaker co-founder leaves and it still keeps some equity, like it's not totally zero sum kind of loss, but part of what I'm always kind of driving at is, look, it's either win-win or lose-lose, right? There are no conflicts among rational men, rational humans. And so nobody's actually winning in this situation. Nobody wants, it isn't in no one's rational best interest to be a drain on the project that they're spending most of their time on over years, right? That's not good for anyone. It's not good for their soul or their character or their, career or their self-development or their reputation. So you're not doing anybody any favors. And so whatever the concrete outcome along that continuum, it always involves some amount of reckoning with, with the kind of relationship debt that's built up, with, the kind of BS that hasn't been called out in a long time. And so it's hard and it's painful and it's messy. And inevitably, everybody comes out on the other side better off. Right. So whether that's, again, one co-founder leaves and goes to do something else that's a better fit, and then the company flourishes without that, lead weight on it, or people get repurposed in a way that's working better. So that's kind of one pattern.
I just want to draw emphasis to one of the things you said, which is that's really interesting to me. And one of the things you said in passing, I want to put a spotlight on it. So you said there are no conflicts of interest among rational men. So that is for the many people in our audience, that will be a familiar phrase. It's a title of an essay by Ayn Rand. It's a sub-theme in Atlas Shrugged. For some people, it's going to be new material. I think it's one of the most radical things Ayn Rand says about human relationships is that you might think there's a conflict here, but if everyone's on the right framework, the correct understanding of one's interests is much deeper than you think it is. So often, and I think this is part of what I'm hearing in your comment here, is that nobody, even the founder who is not pulling his weight or her weight, they're not getting anything. They're a drain on the organization. They're harming their own interests insofar as they're vested in the company. Yeah. So this is a really powerful. To me, it's a really interesting and powerful illustration of that principle. That if you understand what it is, what your self-interest consists in, which is its own kind of challenge, and it sounds like that's part of what you're helping people to conceptualize in these very difficult situations.
Yeah, exactly. And often it's this package deal of like genuine empathy for a person that, has been important in your life and you've spent a long time working with and dealing with, and this kind of altruistic obligation that you feel like you have to prop them up and protect them from harm, right? And the whole thing, the whole thing is premised on a view of people, right? And as altruism, I think it's not right, a view of people that is like pretty unflattering, right? Where this person is fragile and pathetic and unable to fend for themselves and unable to go and do something more constructive where they actually do add value to the world and to their own, lives and ventures, right? And so let me coddle this person and drag our whole company down for the sake of sparing their feelings, right? As if that's actually in anybody's best interest, including theirs, right? And so often what I am helping people see through is just that whole conception of human nature on which you're, sacrifice or be sacrificed, right? That's a pretty sad and pathetic view of your fellow man, right? And or yourself, depending on kind of which role you find yourself in.
I know we're getting a lot of questions. I'm seeing them in the chat. Yeah, I don't think you can see them, but what I'll tell people is Gena will be hosting one of the breakout rooms. So bring your questions, and I think Gena's will be happy to respond to those in that setting. So in the time we have left, still many more questions I want to get to, so let's see how many we can fit in here. So I want to talk a bit about and I think you've written about this as well. A lot of people have a view of founders. If you think about people like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, there's a sort of cultural view of them, and it's reinforced by some of their own behavior, that they're just on a cell. It's like they're deluded. Like, who could really think this would ever succeed? These audacious goals. They're sort of like visionaries, but in a kind of not entirely rational sense of vision. Like, it's almost like they have a vision in a kind of maybe religious sense, and that's sort of the connotation of it. And what is that? So the part of the conception is they're driven by a vision, not by some rational sense of it's going to work and well-founded in reality. And there's so that's sort of the cultural aspect to it. And I want to hear a bit about how you understand this issue, because another thread in your research and scholarship, and you've definitely talked about this and written on it, is this idea of being a truth seeker and being committed to and this, again, I think when I read about this or hear you speak about it, I hear the echoes of, this is echoes of objectivity and Ayn Rand's unique conception of objectivity. So maybe you can help us understand a bit about this issue as it's understood in the culture about founders and self-delusion versus what is the reality like as you're seeing it, and what do you advocate for people in the settings where you're coaching them through these issues?
Yeah. So this is one of the first things I wrote about, because it's so, at the intersection of all my interests and passions. It's called Vision or Delusion. It's actually a two-parter because I had so much to say about it. So if you want to look it up on my Substack, it's Vision or Delusion, why ambitious founders need self-trust, or why ambitious builders need self-trust, something like that. Anyway, but the basic thesis is that having an ambitious vision for your company, for whatever it is you're building, and being able to go and execute on that vision is something that you can only do in proportion to your self-credibility, which has to be earned. So to be able to formulate a belief, so one really important dimension here is, again, it's interesting, this is coming out as a kind of theme. There are levels of abstraction, and we've got to be able to distinguish between these levels of abstraction. So you can have a belief at the level of the internet is going to change everything. This is the example of Jeff Bezos quitting his comfortable, secure finance job in 90 something to start Amazon, to start his little internet bookstore, which was a weird idea right at the time, but it was at a time when the internet was like growing, at like 100x annually or whatever, right? And clearly, like, this was the wave of the future, and everything was going to be on the internet. But like most people weren't even aware of what the internet was yet, right? So you can kind of see the analogs to like today and AI, but like you can have a belief like the internet is going to change everything, and I want to be part of it. It's gonna, like my life will go better. My life will be more, it will be richer, more interesting, afford more opportunities for exciting growth and and projects I believe in, if I'm doing something on the internet, if I'm building something. And that's a belief that like is evidence-based. It's very much like it's based, he was watching the trends, right? And of course it could be wrong, but it's probably not wrong at that level of generality, right? Because like you see the nature of this technology and all the possible affordances of like this kind of distributed communication, and all the different ways that it could change the world. And what you don't then have nurture as a belief is, okay, and the way that I'm going to get rich off the internet is by building an online Barnes and Noble, or whatever it is. Like, this is it. This is what's going to be the next whatever, right? Like, he pivoted a bunch from whatever his original conception of Amazon was, right? And so part of being honest with ourselves and being able to kind of bet on a vision is also being able to hedge our level of certainty, right? And to be really rigorous with ourselves about like, what am I treating as a hypothesis? What am I treating as a, as a probability, like, where does this belief fall on the probability curve? And what kind of evidence would I need to convince me that I'm wrong as well as that I'm right, right? And to be very responsive to evidence and very like aggressively interested in the evidence, which the best entrepreneurs kind of famously are, right? Like, they are testing and iterating, they're putting out an MVP, minimum viable product, to then quickly get customer feedback and see like, am I even on the right track here? Do people actually want this? Is this working the way that I, hypothesizing that it will, right? Rather than nursing some hypothesis that they're treating as a certainty, but like conveniently insulating from any feedback from the outside world, right? Which is not the entrepreneurial approach. And so it's really being able to distinguish between like intellectual ambitiousness, as I've called it, right? Where like you're able to think in deep first principle causal, relations. Like, you're able to really kind of take in a lot of interrelated information about the market and about technology and about human nature and about, all these different, just being intellectually curious, right? Gather a lot of information and integrate across it to see fairly deep trends that you can hold with a fairly high level of confidence, while also being really measured about any more specific hypothesis, right? That like, that is inherently going to be empirical, right? And probabilistic. Like, you don't know that this is going to be the way to get people to buy your stuff, or like that this will be the user interface that people will find easiest to work with or whatever. So yeah, a lot more I could say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you use the term self-trust and sort of being so honest with oneself. Maybe you could flesh that out a bit. So why the emphasis on self-trust? Why
Yeah.
you put it in terms of a reputation with yourself. I think maybe I'm mishearing what you said, but tell us a bit about why you emphasize that aspect of it.
Yeah. So I think, people have an intuitive understanding of why honesty is important in social relationships, right? Because I think we can pretty quickly relate to examples of like, yeah, you just that person was full of, BS, right? Or like this person lost credibility with you, or yeah, you trust certain friends more than others. Like you'll trust this friend with your life, but not with your money, right? Or you'll trust this person. So like we understand trust as it works in interpersonal contexts. And so intuitively it's like, don't lie. Like you're just gonna, we have the boy who cried wolf, which my almost 4-year-old has been obsessively reciting and like repeating its moral. So like we can understand that kind of causal reasoning about why being honest generally serves us. But what is harder, I think, to see, because it requires that extra level of metacognition, introspective insight, is the same mechanism applies even more fundamentally to ourselves. That, and that this is the reason that, like, don't evade. It's sort of like the objectivist sin, right? Evasion is the one sin, but like it's so easy for that to become this categorical imperative, this duty, right? This detached should, just like, whatever Catholic or socialist or whatever duties we had in our heads pre-objectivism. But like, if we actually try to understand it from a selfish causal standpoint, like, why not? Why shouldn't I evade? What's wrong with a little bit of evading here and there? Right? Like, it makes me feel better. And, it's not like, I probably wouldn't have done anything different. But the problem with, apart from the fact that we're missing out on information, right? And so like, we're going to make decisions that based on a distorted data set. So like that's problematic. But psychologically, I think the bigger, more accruing problem is we lose trust with ourselves, just like we lose trust with other people who lie to us, right? Like we know, like there's some part of us that knows we're selectively ignoring, certain kinds of uncomfortable facts or possibilities, or that we're kind of rationalizing away the feedback that we don't like, right? Or the data points that we don't like. And the more we're doing that, the less we believe ourselves, even when we're telling the truth, right? Just like in The Boy Who Cries Wolf. It's hard for us to bet on our own judgment, to bet on our own convictions without the backing of other people to tell us that, no, that's right, you're on the right track. And so it actually makes it harder to be independent, right? Harder to go and like do something new, do something bold, because then we only have ourselves, right, to check against it. And so it's us in reality. There's no answer key. And it's really scary, really hard to just bet on our own judgment that way, unless like we've accrued a lot of self-credibility.
So I want to draw some of these threads together and just offer an observation, see what you think of this. Is that one of the things that impresses me when I'm reading your work and hearing today is that there's I said at the beginning that the very strong echoes or direct ties to Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism and key ideas in that. One of the threads that I see here is that you're helping people build companies, but in doing that, they're building themselves. And there's sort of this twin perspective that we see in Ayn Rand's thought, which is that productiveness is a virtue and pride is a virtue. So pride is about moral ambitiousness, developing oneself and character. And productiveness is about creating the values that life depends on, so these are really twinned in an important way for people who explored this in more depth. I just want to hear, does that resonate with you? Okay.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And I mean, it's been a recurring theme in my work. And in a way, it's the link, or it's the way out of that dichotomy we started with, right? That like either you're all about your work or you're all about yourself. Mm-hmm. Like, who do you think you are? Like, what is yourself if it's not what you spend most of your time doing? And your work is what you spend most of your time doing. And that's not like a fluke or like, a product or social engineering, right? Like it's inherent in the human condition that we create the means of our own survival, right? Like that our productiveness is what makes us human. It is fundamental to who we are. It's the deepest, right? It's like one of our deepest virtues and sources of meaning, fulfillment, right? And all the rest of it. Whereas the way that it's viewed, Greg Salmieri has kind of helped me understand how this is an intellectual default, a historical default pre-Rand, dating back to Aristotle, for whom production wasn't a salient virtue because he had slaves to do all the menial labor, right? To kind of like to actually create and maintain the means of his physical survival so that he could engage in his intellectual work. And obviously he was highly productive as an intellectual, but like it wasn't part of his worldview that like physical production is the basis of all of this, right? And the basis of our, and that like we wouldn't be able to sustain ourselves, nor should we expect to, right? That there's an inherent dependency and an inherent kind of exploitativeness about any moral view of, philosophy, any moral view that doesn't include production as a core virtue, right? As a core self-defining, self-determining process. So yeah.
Gena, I want to keep going, but I want to make sure we get time in the breakout room. So that'll be our next phase of the conversation. So I just want to say one quick thing before we turn to the breakouts. And one is to thank you for doing this work. It's really fascinating to me. I don't read a lot in this space, but I came away from this really exhilarated to just see just how much this can be unlocked with clearer thinking and more sort of reality-oriented thinking and an understanding of the human nature that's true to what reality is. And I wanted to, I think I'd love to share with people that we mentioned that you're writing a lot on Substack and you have a podcast, or you have been involved in a podcast. And one of the things that I want people to know and to acknowledge, some of them are in this audience, that the Anthem Foundation, which is affiliated with the ARI. So Anthem Foundation supports scholarship on objectivism in academia and high-level research. So the Anthem Foundation has awarded you a grant last year. We're really excited to see that. And that's for a large-scale project of writing that I'm excited to see come forward. So
nothing more than a large-scale writing project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully it comes. I don't know what the timeline is, but we'll bracket the timeline because that really is something on your side of it. But we're really proud to see you move this forward. And the Anthem Foundation grant is made possible by a number of our donors who allocate resources just for Anthem Foundation. So Anthem Foundation is supporting your work right now. It supports work for a number of other scholars at UT Austin, among them Greg Salmieri, whom you mentioned. So we're really excited for that. And I wanted just to call out that to thank those donors who are here and who are making this possible. We're excited to see the fruit of this important work that you're doing, Gena. And thank you for being here with us today.
And thank you so much. As ever, you mentioned, Alon, some of the many ways I've interfaced with the Institute and with this community as I've grown up and pursued my work and my self-development hand in hand. And I don't even know where the heck I'd be without this ARI, but it wouldn't be here. And so thank you truly from the mind and heart. And
I will say as well that thanks to the donors who are here and those who are absent, who are making the work of Anthem Foundation possible, the Institute possible. And if this is something exciting to you and you would like to help make Anthem grants available to other scholars, we'd welcome your support. Why don't you reach out to us, and particularly Gena's work and other scholars as well. So we've got the poll on the screen. We'd love to get your feedback. It's really helpful for us to know how we're doing. We want to make sure you're enjoying and benefiting from these events. So just if you can respond to that. And then my colleague Jimavit in the background is going to activate the breakout rooms. And we're excited for you. If you're interested in joining, there'll be a room that Gena's hosting. My colleague, Ben Baer, an instructor at Ayn Rand University, will be hosting a room. And if you're interested in Ayn Rand Con, which is the conference I mentioned at the beginning of today's event, and you want to hear more about the program, Ben was involved in designing the program. He'll also be a speaker at one of the events. You're welcome to join his room. And my colleague, Stephen Shub, and he is in our development team, and he's had a different role up until now, but he's moving into the development team. But Stephen's background is really fascinating. I really enjoy talking with Stephen. His background is in theatrical performance, on screen, on stage, in movies and things like that. So, and that'll be a room for people who are interested in talking about sharing recommendations for movies and TV shows, if you would like to do that. And just if you want to hear about what the work Stephen is doing at the Institute and his background. So you're welcome to join that room. I think it looks like the rooms are open. And if you need help joining a room, we can give you a hand. And if you'd like to skip out, just turn your mic and camera off, and we'll know you're stepping away. But we hope you join us at the end. I'm going to invite Gena to give us maybe a couple of closing thoughts, her perspective on this work and what's exciting to her. So I hope you'll join us for that at the end. And let's open the rooms and join. It looks as if everyone is coming back from the breakout rooms. Thanks for staying with us. I was in Gena's room. I took the liberty of joining her room. I hope you guys had fun in the other rooms you were in. I am really pleased to have had today's conversation. I wanted to thank Gena for taking the time. I know we got a little glimpse of what Gena's day looks like at home. She's got 2 little kids, and we'll get into it, but it's really good of her to take time out of her day to be with us today. Gena, I wanted to invite you back for a couple of minutes and just, before we went to the breakout rooms, I mentioned this big project that you're working on that Anthem Foundation is sponsoring. We thanked the donors and invited people who want to support us more. And you said, in part, you don't know where you would be intellectually without the Institute. And I understand, and I appreciate, on behalf of the Institute, I appreciate what that means. But I also want to acknowledge that you have your own raw talent that you're bringing in. So that's important to acknowledge here as well. And I appreciate that. I wanted to just offer you the last word here, and just in terms of, is there one thing or one encounter or something that you would say as, this was a really pivotal thing for me in my development with the Institute, a point of contact? Was it the essay contest? Well, and I don't know what in your journey stands out to you. Maybe it's an ongoing conversation. I just want to hear a bit from your perspective what that looks like, how you think of that kind of encounter you've had through the Institute.
Sure. Ooh, good question. I mean, I have reflected on, like what have been the pivotal influences and turning points in my life. I mean, it's the friendships that I have formed with people like Greg, Salmieri, people like my now husband, Matt, but also, Onkar and you, and, a lot of the people we all know, some of the people in this room who have been fellow travelers, but also sources of constant ongoing inspiration and reality testing, of like when I spoke of the need for self-trust, building credibility. I don't think we can do, certainly I could never have done that without really selectively surrounding myself with the people whom I trust to call out my BS and to push back, on my assumptions and kind of gut reactions. And also to hear what I'm saying and build on it and deepen it by their own thoughtful reflections and paraphrasing. And that's what, it's not one encounter that's like a discrete, it's precisely the way that I've sourced the wisdom and the camaraderie, the visibility of those people throughout my life and at every pivotal juncture with every big decision, but also just like in the day-to-day of graduate school, figuring out how to prioritize my time, what to make of my data, what projects to go after, how any of this connects to any of the other things. I mean, how to think entrepreneurially about my work. I mean, I feel like I owe so much to that core group of people whom ARI has quite literally introduced me to. So
yeah, that's wonderful to hear. I have similar kind of thought about one of the things we talk about in these roundtables is the work of the Institute and reaching vast numbers of people at scale, which is a big part of what we do. Another part of what we do is developing intellectuals and supporting them. And one of the things I hear in your comment is what isn't very visible, and I'm glad you raised it because it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge it, which is part of the way we develop people is through the kind of discussions you're talking about and engaging people, not only in the classroom. So we talk a lot about the Ayn Rand University, which is core educational experience, training new people. And then beyond that, we do so many other things that are not in the public view. And that's right, they don't need to be in the public view. but the way I think of some of what you're saying is that we're building an intellectual movement, and an intellectual movement includes the kind of interactions you're describing. And it's so important. I've experienced some of that with my colleagues, and I really enjoy working and learning from you as well. And I think of that as, for objectivism to grow, it needs large numbers of people to become interested in Ayn Rand, increasing numbers of people to become intellectuals, and for those intellectuals to view themselves as in a collaborative effort, not in a kind of regimented military style approach, but definitely a network of people with aligned interests and are mutually supportive of that larger goal of developing themselves. And so I'm really glad you found that beneficial. And again, speaking for myself, really proud to have this ongoing relationship with you. I'm looking forward to reading more on your Substack. Someone asked us how to find that. I apologize. I should have put that on the slide. You can find her work on the web, genagorlin.com. And I think your Substack, if people want to Google it, is Building the Builders. That we'll put a link to that.
Builders.genagorlin.com.
There we go. That's a direct link to yeah. There we go. Thank you, Jimavit, for putting that in the chat for those of you who want to explore further. So let me thanks for bringing your expertise and your knowledge and this exciting project to us today, Gena. Let me thank everyone else who is still with us today, and for all those who joined. We are really thankful, and I say this every month. I close the roundtables, I say it, and it's always true that we never take for granted the support that you guys give us. It means everything to the work that we do. It makes our work possible. And we recognize that. And that's one of the reasons we hold these events. We want to connect with you. We want to show you some of what your contributions make possible, and to give you the widest possible panorama on the work of the Institute, both inside, back behind the scenes, and then on the front, sort of more public face of things. So we thank you for being supporters of the Institute. Thank you for being with us today and sharing this roundtable with us, and for hearing and sharing your questions with Gena too. So thank you all for being Institute supporters. We appreciate you being members. I'm going to sign off, and Gena, feel free to sign off. What we do now, no commitment to stay. What we do now is we leave the venue open for people who want to connect, and similar to our public events, if you want to stick around and chat with other people in the audience, we will open up the mics. And you're welcome to stay as long as you want. And Gena, again, I know you have other things on your mind today at home, so feel free to sign off too. But thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. And thank you again, Gena.